Shop. Thank you so much for making it out on your Friday night. We are very excited to have Kimberly Brock here today, celebrating her novel, The Fabled Earth. So congratulations. She's here tonight in conversation with Alli Dyer, who wrote Strange Folk. So it'll be a 30-minute conversation between the two of them. We'll open it up to a Q&A and a book signing. But to kick this off, I'll do a quick intro for both of them. So Kimberly Brock is the best-selling author of The Lost Book of Dyer, which was shortlisted for the prestigious Townsend Prize for Fiction, and the River Witch recipient of the Georgia Author of the Year Award. She is the founder of Tinderbox Writers Workshop and has served as a guest lecturer for many regional and national writing workshops, including at the Pat Conroy Literary Center. A native of North Georgia, she now lives near Atlanta, and as I said, The Fabled Earth is her newest novel out. And Alli Dyer grew up in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Southwest Virginia, where her family has lived for generations. For the last decade, she has worked in entertainment and book publishing and now lives in Los Angeles. And Strange Folk, which came out earlier this year, is her first novel. So enjoy and take it away.
Thank you. Well, I'm very excited to talk about this beautiful, beautiful book.
Thank you.
I think first off, you should just tell us a little bit about it.
All right. Well, first, what I'm going to do is say I'm so excited to be sitting here with you. I was so excited when your book came out, and anybody who's writing about Appalachian witches, I need to know that. So, this book is set on the Georgia coast. It is a dual historical timeline, 1932 and 1959. There is our most southernmost island in Georgia is Cumberland Island, and it's mostly undeveloped, and it's a national park today. And back in the 1880s, the Carnegie family built winter homes there, and they are still there, crumbling wonderfully Southern Gothic. So I made up a story. It's got 3 points of view, 3 women. One of them you see in 1932 as a young girl who comes to Cumberland to work for the family for the summer because she wants to be an artist in residence. They have a little cottage. And her grandfather was a folklorist and published a little book with his watercolor illustrations, and she's aspiring to do the same thing. And she makes some really bad choices that summer while a group of kids, wealthy boys, have come together for the summer and one young lady. And they tell stories around a bonfire one night, and things go very badly, and 2 boys drown. And then decades later, in 1959, the daughter of the other girl that was there comes with questions about what happened to her mother. And Cleo Woodbine has been living alone on this little island. It's very ghosty. There's a lot of folklore and a lot of secrets she's been keeping. Frances Flood is a folklorist. And when she shows up with all these questions, it begins to raise a lot of secrets from that summer in 1932. And then there's a third character, Audrey Howell. She is 19, 20 years old and just married right out of high school, like you did in 1959, when you're already in your wedding dress, right, when you graduate. And her husband dies within a couple of months. So she's also just widowed. And she comes to run an inn on, there's a little town that I fictionalized because it's Southern fiction, and I kind of like keeping it mythical and mystical rather than having it all be too real. And the town is called Reverie, and she is running the inn that her aunt used to run. And she takes some photos around town, and when she develops them, one of them is an accidental double exposure. And there's a face of one of the boys from the night in 1932 in one of the photographs, and everybody thinks maybe she's raised a ghost. So ghost stories, folklore, and Southernisms.
The setting is such a huge part of the book. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about Cumberland Island. I love the islands in Georgia. Like my mom and I go to St. Simon's all the time. Yeah.
Really? I just came home from there.
Oh yeah. They're super magical. Like all the live oak trees have like Spanish moss hanging from them. And yeah, they're pretty special.
So that's an interesting thing we have in common
Yeah.
too. And I know you can't tell that I'm from North Georgia by listening to this accent. I grew up about 30 minutes south of Chattanooga, Tennessee. But I grew up going to St. Simon's Island.
Oh, cool.
So isn't that funny?
Yeah.
My dad's best friend had a house down there, and that was the first trip to the ocean that I can remember. So I'm attached to that place, and he brought my mom a lot of Southern fiction to read while I was growing up, those big clunky 1980s, 1990s novels, you know, and so I loved those stories, those big epic saga stories. So I guess that was my personal connection to Cumberland Island. Cumberland has this long history. It's there's indigenous history on that island. There's revolutionary history on that island. There's Civil War history on that island. There's everything you can imagine on that island present in a southern coastal island. Plus, in the 1880s. So you know Andrew Carnegie, he gave all his money away, he built all the libraries. Well, he had a brother, Thomas. And Thomas's wife wanted a place to build a winter home. And she had heard about the island, and they went there, and she fell in love with this particular spot. There was a place that was already there, standing, a house called Dungeness. And it was a revolutionary British soldier had built this thing. It's a big 4-story concrete tabby structure. It wasn't very friendly looking. And they wanted to purchase that property. And I'm not even making this up. The people who owned it at the time were cousins to Jefferson Davis. So like weird Southern history.
Well, this is what I wanted to know. Because I know when you do historical research, you always find the weird facts that inspire the story.
Yeah, like how do you make that up? So they wanted it. He didn't want to sell it to them. And then I can't recall because I'm not a historian. I'm a storyteller. So like I gather pieces of information, historical information, like little sparkly things, like a bird, you know, and then I just sort of tuck them in, and I have to have my notes or I forget all about what's real and what's my imagination. It was his son or grandson that the current owner accidentally shot out of a tree, 5 years old, thought he was a bird, and he died. And so he called up the Carnegies right fast and said, how quick can you get here? You can have it. So they bought it, and they tore that structure down and built a new one, a big Victorian, fancy house, huge. They called it Dungeness after the first house, same name. And within a couple of years, Thomas died. But the house was not even finished yet. So this is not like, it starts to sound like a Stephen King novel, right?
I feel like the person always dies.
I know. And so then there's Lucy, his wife, who, first of all, like, why do you come from Pittsburgh with all of that money and come to this wild, undeveloped, strange place where you have to bring everything by boat and build this monstrous house? Who is she? I wanted to know who she was.
Cool. Yeah.
9 kids, 9 children. So they come and they winter there, and it's this wild place where there are no rules. Everything has to be brought by boat. Lots of wild parties, all of the things you would think, airstrips, golf courses. They built all this stuff on this island, which is just constantly trying to take it back because it's wild. And then she built houses on the island for her children. So there's a house there now. Plum Orchard is in this book, and it's this huge white monstrosity of a house. It's Greek revival, and it looks like an elephant. Like, you can't even, all these houses look like they've just been dropped from the sky. Mm-hmm. And they're sitting there like, how do we get here? Like, they know they don't belong there. What is this Gilded Age mansion doing in this creepy place with all this moss? And it's beautiful, but it's so strange. And then the other one that's still there today, and nobody lives in Plum Orchard now, you can tour it, is Grayfield. And Grayfield is an inn now. And the only hotel that you can stay on the island or camp. And I can't camp because I have a spinal fusion. So sad for me, I had to stay at Grayfield a few years ago for my 25th wedding anniversary.
Oh, that's fun.
And that's the beginning. I don't want to trip over other questions you may have because I'll
No, you did a great job because I
started thinking about it.
I was also interested in like those little weird like I said, those little weird facts that you find in your historical research, you know, and how those sort of spark new ideas. Do you have any more of those, or were like those sort of like the highlights?
So there's lots of creepy stories that I did not put into the book that are actually true historical fact with the Carnegie family and other families. Like the Candler family owned parts of the north end of the island. They're the Coca-Cola family. And then there were hotels and there were trolleys and ferries and all kinds of things that were going on at different periods of time. But it's like the island kind of takes it back over and over. These things just disappear over time. And I found that really interesting. Also, we got married in 1996 in a little bitty wedding in our backyard. I grew up in a farmhouse with a big oak tree. It was 100 years old. And we were married in the morning at 10 and we were on a plane at 1. So like it was over with. It was 25 people in folding chairs. 2 little ladies made pound cake.
Oh, I love
it. It was just very quiet, you know, we loved it. So when we had to find something to do for our 25th wedding anniversary, he knew I wanted to go to Cumberland and had never been there. So he got tickets and you get there by ferry. There's no cars except National Park Service has cars and maybe some people who still live on the island. And the ferry that took us over, we were the only people on the ferry going over, so it was quiet while we're pulling up alongside the island. And I remember right after we got married that summer, maybe 3 months after, I think it was in September, it hit the news and we heard in Georgia, just like everybody else did, that JFK Jr. and Carolyn Bessette had been married in a secret wedding on Cumberland Island. And I was so charmed. And I thought, oh, we're just like the Kennedys. And, you know, it's funny. That's what stories do, though. They connect you to people that you have nothing in common with. But then I felt very connected to them because of our 2 weddings. And then I remember that plane crash a few years later. And it was just tragic. And I had lost a friend in college just recently in a car accident. And something about my grief about her death and then that plane crash kind of got tangled up. I was sort of obsessed with it a little bit. And so fast forward to our 25th wedding anniversary and we're pulling up alongside that island. I hadn't thought about that, but it was quiet. And you know what live oaks look like. And all that moss is swaying. It was just spooky. And I thought, this would have been their 25th wedding anniversary too. Ooh. And all the hair stood up on my head. And I thought, well, I've been thinking I wanted to write a ghost story. I think this is the spot. And so, you know, some of those little things, the way stories work and the way you feel connected, and through our ghost stories, especially, we both come right out of the mountains where I think that's just a thing. We hear people talk about ghost stories. We experience our own ghost stories. I've been telling some ghost stories on tour. And that was one of them, that moment, realizing that there's all of this strange history in this place. Mm-hmm. People who have come and gone in unlikely ways. So that's part of it, I guess.
That dovetails perfectly with another question I wanted to ask. So my book is about Appalachian witches, and a lot of people would ask me when I would do events, like, are you a practicing witch? Like, or do you do spells? And I would have to tell them no, you know, and they would sort of ask me questions about if I believed in it and so I thought that would be an interesting question to ask you, like, do you believe in ghosts, or how would you describe your belief in ghosts and your experience with ghosts and supernatural phenomena?
Yeah.
Like that?
So I just talked about this, night before last. One of the things that I always talk about with this island in particular, and all of my books thus far have been set on the Georgia coast. And why is that? Why do I set things on the coast? And why do all my books tend to have a little bit of that in them about ghost stories? And I think for this book, I had said at a workshop I was teaching at the Pat Conroy Center, I said, I believe all stories are ghost stories. And I thought, oh, I'm so smart. That sounds so smart. And then I thought, do I really think that? What does that even mean? And so that was the question I brought to this book and to these characters. I wanted to see what each of them are all stories, ghost stories. And I think I believe that. So why? So that's what I was doing with this. And the setting for it. There is a place in the river between Cumberland Island and the mainland. It's a salt creek where the tide runs both ways. And I really became attached to that metaphor and that idea that that's what I'm trying to get at here somehow with ghost stories. And what I finally, when I finished the book, realized what I really think is, as human beings, the thing that we have, I think that is the most human thing that we do is that we tell stories. And it's a very spiritual thing that we tell stories. And I think when I looked at that river, I thought, that's like us. You exist on a fixed point in your life, but you have to be able to reflect on the past and also dream about the future. And you do it all at the same time. That's how stories move. They move through time. They move across oceans. This is where the folklore comes in, right? They move across continents. They move through families, but they connect us. And I think we're the ghosts. So I do think all stories are ghost stories. Do I believe in ghosts? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Uh-huh.
And I have a ghost story.
Yeah.
So I was 9 weeks early in 1972, and I was a twin, and my twin died the day after we were born. And my mom remarried when I was 2 years old, and it's about 3, and my dad is the most practical man on the planet. There's nothing woo-woo about my dad, but he still tells this story. He said he woke up in the middle of the night, and I was standing in my gown on his side of the bed. And he said, Kim, what are you doing in bed? Go get back in your bed. And he followed me across the hall, put me back in bed, and flipped on the light. And I was not there. I was at my grandparents' a mile down the road where I was every Friday night. And when he tells that story, I'm not afraid. It's not a boo.
Yeah, I mean, I got chills, but
scary ghost story, but it is poignant, you know.
Yeah.
And it is. We're sure that she was just checking in.
Yeah.
She just wanted to have a look at him and
Yeah.
make sure we were all doing okay. And I have always felt a comfort in that. And I think when I write all of my books, some element of that is in them. The idea that there is more than I know. I want to be curious. I want to wonder. I don't want to know.
Mm-hmm.
I want to wonder, and I want people to wonder when they read.
Yeah, that's cool. Have you ever seen any ghosts, like you personally?
Should I tell them the truth? My husband's here. They're recording me. I think we maybe have something in the house we're in now.
Ooh.
Yeah. It's
Can
not
you say
like
more?
it's not a bad thing either. It's
No.
We've only been in this house about 4 years, but we've both said, and it's just a feeling more than a seeing and awareness.
Yeah.
And I'm not at all afraid. I'm not at all worried about it. And that's the most interesting part to me.
Is it in a certain part of the house? Where is it?
It's in the corner of our living room going toward our bedroom, and sometimes in our bedroom, like at the foot of the bed. And that's the other thing I keep saying. I wonder if it's the same thing.
Yeah. And do you know the history of the house?
It's not very old, but there was a farm there before.
Okay.
So I don't know. I may have brought her with me.
Interesting. Oh, and you think it's a her?
Could be.
Do you have that feeling?
I have that feeling.
Do you have any other sense of any details?
No.
Because my brother sees spirits, and
Oh, yeah?
he saw spirits when he was little.
This is just you feel like you see something, and then you're not sure you did.
Right.
It's an interesting, yeah.
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 Cool. Very cool. Well, I wanted to ask, was the Fabled Earth the title that you originally had for the book?
So I usually don't get to title my books.
Okay.
The River Witch, I did. It was a small press, so they were great with whatever I came to them with.
Yeah.
The Lost Book of Eleanor Dare, I did not title. I did title it, but that's not the title we used. This one, we kind of had a word salad thing going because I didn't have an exact title when I came to them. And eventually, though, those were my words. Those were my choices.
Oh, good.
I knew I wanted fable to be in it because the whole thing is a folklore. I'm writing Southern fiction. The South is not a real place.
Yeah.
When you write about it, it's a fiction. It's a folklore. I mean, we make it whatever we want it to be in the story that we're telling because it's so complicated and strange and just it's old. It's our oldest history in this country, and it's a horror, and it's a romance. It's all of the things. So It's very complicated. It is a fable. So I knew I wanted that to be part of the title, and then I don't know. I like it, and I wanted to give it some grounding. I wanted it to be real and mythical at the same time. So that's what we came up with.
Cool. I like it.
Thank
I was
you.
just curious. I like sort of
And I
hearing
like your
some
title.
of those.
Oh, we could just have a little love fest here about these books.
I also wanted to ask you, so Cleo in the book has a grandfather who is from Appalachia, and he gets addicted to morning glory seeds, right? Which are like produce like a hallucinogenic effect, which I thought was really cool, and I had never heard of that before. And I was curious about your own connection to Appalachia, and like, because you've mentioned it before, but I've never actually gotten to hear sort of about that more.
Yeah. So I grew up, like I said, in the foothills of Appalachia, and I grew up on a farm. My grandfather was on a tractor, seemed like 24/7. So very early childhood, grew up in this old house that I felt like was just built out of stories. It was all stories all the time. We had no air conditioning, no insulation in the house. The cats would come through where the pipes came into the house. You'd be sitting at dinner and the cabinet door would open and a cat would come out.
It's like my dream.
Right. So like that is how I grew up. And I remember my grandmother working in the garden, and she hated the morning glory vines in her garden, and I loved them. I remember pitching a fit. I was probably 5 years old because I didn't want her hoeing them up. I loved them. And the same with dandelions, but the morning glory was a thing. And so that little bit of that memory, I guess, went into it. And I don't know, I guess when you grow up like that, I grew up in church. So there was a lot of, hearing stories from the pulpit. That's, I think, absolutely part of growing up in Appalachia. You hear storytelling there. We heard lots of stories around fires at night, and there were lots of ghost stories. And if you stayed in the kitchen and stayed under the table where they didn't know where you were, you heard a lot of good things, right? Yeah. So there was a lot of that going on growing up. Party lines were awesome. We had a party line. Do you know what a party line is? Mm-hmm. The telephone was shared with neighbors, and you could pick it up and listen to the conversations your neighbor was having and learn all kinds of language, and like it was good stuff. So the idea of listening to stories and stories being told are a big part of Appalachia for me. The music is a big part of I love fiddle music. I love history. I love pottery. I love gardens. And I grew up, we didn't have a lot of money. So, it was a very earthy childhood. And the bookmobile and free lunches and all of those things were part of my childhood. And I wanted to have a character here. I said it specifically in 1959. I'm skipping around here because of a historical event. and I'll get to that here in a second. But I wanted Cleo to be somebody who was a little bit me. Because when I showed up on that island that day with my husband and we looked at all of that wealth, I felt very out of place with this little accent and this little person. Like, I don't know what all that is. I can't even begin to imagine how to fit into that. And her character has that feeling about her, right?
Mm-hmm.
But she has a depth to her that they lack, that comes from her grandfather, and this attachment to place and attachment to stories and people and history.
And she's an artist.
And so there's something to all of that, I guess, that when I wanted to bring to it. I also really like the fact that my state has both, has the foothills and the coast, and that's me too, right?
Yeah.
That's how we started this conversation. So I like bringing those two things together because I really do believe our stories are what connect us in the most humane ways, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's where the setting comes from. The 1959 thing I'll just mention. So the true history in this book, aside from all the social change that's going on in 1959 that I tap into for these characters, and they're making a mess of it, and so do I as a woman living in 2024 trying to grapple with that. But 1959, Dungeness Mansion burned in an arson.
Like it burned to the ground?
It burned. It destroyed it. It's just a ruin now. So you can go and see the ruins, which are fantastically spooky if you like it. And they never charged anybody with the crime, of course. So I could speculate a little about that. So I wanted that to be at the end of the book. And so that's kind of why I chose the years I chose for it.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Let's see. Oh, is there anything you'd like to say about the book that for some reason never gets brought up, or that you want readers to take away that you never get asked about, or didn't get put in the marketing materials?
I pretty much tell everything.
Or something?
I just told you I see ghosts. What more do you want, Alli?
Well, when I was like first having to like put together materials for it and talk to my publisher, it felt so overwhelming to try to put all of those ideas and inspirations and everything, just try to boil it down, to something that can sell it easily. So I just wondered if there was some dimension of it that just gets lost in sort of the marketing, basically.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
I think for me, it's about these three women who don't know who they are. And I think in 1959, you're right on the cusp of a lot of change. And the thing about that, when you make that statement, you don't know that you are. You don't know that you're living in 1959, right on the cusp of a lot of change.
Yeah.
That just sounds smart to say now looking back, but you don't know it when you're that person. We don't know that we are living in 2024, right on the cusp of a lot of change. But
I don't know. I feel like our culture is
I
extremely
know.
self-reflective now, constantly just
This is
putting out
true.
think pieces about what's
And
happening.
I
in this
wanted
moment.
to take them at these three different ages and put them in this situation where they only know one another, or they only know themselves best after knowing one another. They reflect on themselves, that they're like mirrors to one another. And I haven't really talked about that a lot in terms of the fact that it really is a woman's story. But it's a woman at three different stages of life. It's this 20-year-old who's, she is still such a girl that she feels like when she's with the young people in town, like she can't figure out that she's a woman. She wants to be with them, but she can't. They look at her and don't see her that way anymore. It's just like that. She's grown up and she doesn't know how to be grown up. And then you have Frances Flood, who is on the verge of being a spinster in her 20s in 1959. People think, why is she not married? And she's due to fall in love, and that's a whole different time of your life, and she's finding her independence at the same time. And I like that, because 1959, that's not necessarily what a lot of women were getting to do. And then Cleo, everybody talks about her like she's old, but she's not. She's just barely 50.
Yeah.
And so she's got all this life left, and she's been living as a recluse, and she's looking at it and thinking, well, I got a lot of time left. What am I going to do with this? Because there is a storm of the century on the horizon during this book that all the sailors and all of the little people in town are talking about. And it's a rumor. It's just, something they just like to speculate about. It's a folklore. And they do have a storm, but they're saying, oh, this little place that she's living is going to be gone. She's having to think about the future. What am I going to do with myself with all this time left? And I like looking at them as sort of this clock of a woman's life, and how that.
Very cool. Well, thank you for talking with me about
you.
this. It's such an amazing book.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Should we ask if anybody has questions?
Yeah.
Any questions?
How did the writing process compare for writing this one to like others? Did you find any harder than previous novels that you've written?
So my first novel is it's not very long. It's not even 300 pages, and it's a literary fiction novel. It's also set on a fictional island off the coast of Georgia. So I kind of started my fascination with that there. So that part of it, is just, I feel like I'm sort of in the groove with that. Although the book I'm getting ready to write is set in mountains of North Carolina. So we'll see how that goes. Or if I find myself back on an island, whether I want to be or not.
Do you ever find it challenging to like find a new way of like describing the surf?
Sometimes I do.
The moss.
I do. The history for my second novel was overwhelming. It was huge, because it is about the lost colony of Roanoke in North Carolina. But it doesn't solve that mystery. It actually deals with this obscure little bit of Georgia history where they found stones that were inscribed with messages in the 30s and 40s, and they attributed them to a survivor of the colony. And I had made up 16 generations of women who believed they had descended from that survivor of the colony. So there was a lot of historical, tidbits that I had to pick through and decide, well, which things matter, because there's just such a vast amount of history there. And that was good training for this, because the history of Cumberland is so long, and there's all these fun little weird, I could have gone down so many rabbit holes. And then the Carnegie family is huge. 9 kids. It just goes on and on. You have no idea how many strange stories I came across. So learning how to take historical fact and interesting tidbits of historical detail and then put them toward that overarching question, are all stories ghost stories, that I'm putting to each of these characters. That's really kind of how I go through it and weed through which things am I going to include in this and what am I just going to have to just not use, and some of it I really want to use. So there are some fun stories.
Is that question actually in the book? Like, if somebody did listen to the talk tonight, would they know?
Yes.
Do you have the question?
So Cleo's grandfather tells her that all stories are ghost stories. And when Cleo is a little girl, she suffers a tragedy when her parents die. And she has imaginary friends, and they are the characters, the folklore characters from her grandfather's stories. And then after 1932, when things go really bad that night, and she ends up getting what she wanted, she gets her little artist cottage, and she lives there by herself. Those same figments are what keep her company on the island. And so you have a little taste of ghost stories and what they mean to her there. And she's kind of trying to figure out What do I really believe is going on? Have I lost my mind? Or is it okay that these stories? I've wondered that. Like, I thought to myself, I think our ghost stories haunt us, whatever they are, whether it's a place or a person or a memory, they haunt us. But what if they really walked along beside you? And so I gave that story to Cleo. So yeah, they're there. It sneaks in. There's an old movie theater in this book. So there's this storytelling that goes on in this historic movie theater, kind of like what they've got right down the road here. I grew up with an old movie theater like that my grandmother told me had a ghost, which I love. And a library that I grew up with an old library because we had no air conditioning. So we went to the library a lot. It was beautiful.
I bet.
And, the idea of that, those two places from my own childhood, those are my ghost stories because those were the two places as a little girl I remember first learning about segregation. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, because I wanted to go upstairs in the old library and they wouldn't let you go upstairs. And I got really upset. And I remember my mom saying, you're lucky you can even be in here. I remember when I was growing up, there were people who couldn't come in this library. And later, I remember thinking about that when we go back there. And I was a little girl in the 80s, like, trying to imagine that. And the same with the theater. There was a balcony I wanted to sit in, and it was closed. You couldn't go up there. And my grandmother saying there used to be people who had to sit in the balcony. You're lucky you get to sit down here. So these stories, those are the stories that haunt me. So, where I pick and choose the history and try and connect it with the theme are from those things.
Cool.
What town did you grow up in?
I grew up in Dalton, Georgia, the carpet capital of the world.
Is it northwest towards like Rome and Cave Springs and
Yes, ma'am. I went to college in Rome, Georgia.
in Barry?
I went to Shorter College on a theater scholarship, but my family all went to Barry. So I was the black sheep. My dad's dad helped build the girls' dorms at Barry. And I directed a children's play at the theater, the DeSoto Theater in Rome. That theater was in my mind too when I was writing this. And I spent a semester interning at the School for the Deaf, the Georgia School for the Deaf in Cave Springs. And we bought my wedding dress, my 1912 Sears and Roebuck wedding dress in a store in Cave Springs the week before we got married. So yes to all of that. How do you even know where Cave Springs, Georgia is?
I lived in Atlanta and had a friend that lived in Cave Springs and used to go there
Yeah,
like every weekend to get out of Atlanta
yeah.
for
And it is beautiful.
years.
It's a quiet little place.
Yeah.
Just barely a little dot on the map, though, right there, right on the Alabama line.
Yeah, they live in Cedartown now.
Oh my
Was
gosh.
it Vintage Go-Go where you got your dress?
I think so. I think so. Yeah. Oh, how funny. Where else would it be? There wasn't much there.
The general store.
Yeah.
had-
Yeah. See, we came all the way to LA for a lady to ask me about Cave Springs, Georgia. Isn't that funny? Our stories connect us.
Yeah. It's interesting that people still drink the water there.
Oh my gosh. No. We say that about Dalton just because it's carpet mills, no telling what's in the water. I know.
And where do you live now?
We now live in Alpharetta. Yeah, just on the north side of Atlanta. Yeah.
I lived in Sandy Springs for a while.
How did you get here? We'll have to talk. We moved right after we got married. We lived in Seattle for 4 years. And then we were in the Raleigh-Durham area before we moved back to the Atlanta area. And I taught kids. I taught kids with behavior disorders and learning disorders. So you guys have been great tonight.
Oh,
Well, thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you so
everyone
much.
for coming.
Like I said, we have plenty of books up front to purchase. We'll keep you guys perched up here for some signings, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.